I believe we can now start. Welcome all to our social inclusion webinar. This is one of the first international webinars on sport for development during COVID-19. And today we'll be discussing the research results of our author's work, but also explore how the pandemic influenced sport's potential for inclusiveness and development. Allow me to present today's speakers. We have Reinhard Haudenhuyse from Vrije Universiteit, Brussel, the co-editor of the 2020 issue this webinar is based on. Then our authors, Rob Cunningham from the University of New South Wales in Australia, Emily Hayday from Loughborough University, London in the UK, and Mark Norman from McMaster University in Canada. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Saraswati Negi from the international NGO Coaches Across Continents. She is joining us from India and will share her experience on how the pandemic has affected her personal work and the field of sport for development. To all, thank you very much for joining us. To our audience, as you can see, I will now share this image. You can see here the structure and organization of today's webinar. So feel free to ask your questions throughout the session in the Q&A format in the bottom of your screen. We will pass them on to our speakers once the presentations are over. For those who have Twitter, do comment, share your thoughts, your remarks, the highlights of the webinar using the hashtag WebinarSI, also on the bottom of your screen. I wish you all a pleasant webinar. And Ryan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Rodrigo. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you're tuning in from. My name is Reinhard. I'm affiliated with the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Maybe it's a good idea. Thanks for joining in the webinar, but it would be great if you can briefly put in the chat from which country and city you're tuning in to get the chat a bit going. So why a webinar on sport for development and why link it to the posts? Between brackets, pandemic, there are two reasons. The first reason is related to the fact that together with Pascal Delhaye from Belgium, Kirsten Verkooyen from the Netherlands, Dan Parnell and John Hayton from the UK, I acted as a guest editor on a special issue in the open access journal Social Inclusion on the topic of sport for development. So as such, this webinar acts as a promotional tool for the special issue, and this through showcasing 3 papers and a reflection from the field. You can freely access all the papers on and the rest of the three papers today on the website. So the special issue was published in 2020, which means pre-COVID-19. And the main idea was to invite authors to approach sport for development from a trans and interdisciplinary perspective. That was also the title. And we did this since we felt that the sport for development field seems to be sometimes stuck in its monodisciplinary track, which is mainly applied sports, social sciences, or what. And I dare to say we can perhaps see some first sign that the sport for development field has even become a bit saturated. So new studies are either replications or do not add new significant knowledge to the body of research. As said, this is perhaps one of the first international webinars on sport for development and the pandemic, and this brings me to the second reason for having this seminar. And the selection of papers is specifically chosen to address issues that have become perhaps more visible or pertinent during the pandemic. For one, young people have been impacted heavily on almost every aspect of their lives: social, psychological, educational, physical. Looking at my own country, I'm inclined to say that we have failed young people so far during this pandemic. And perhaps as sport for development academics, we have also failed in our research to look at people and young people beyond mere participants of sport for development program at a fixed moment in time and place. It is in his presentation that Rob Cunningham and colleagues look at the impact of a sport for development initiative using the life trajectory perspective, which is kind of unique. The second one, the pandemic has bombarded us with online teaching, education, and yes, the seemingly never-ending team or Zoom meetings. A sector that has exploded during the current pandemic is e-gaming. And while physical sports were suspended, e-sport viewers and participants figures soared. So we need to further think how e-sports can be used as a developmental virtual space, and maybe not only for young people. And Emily Hayday addresses the topic of e-sport in her paper presentation. And finally, we all have been confronted with different forms of restrictions in our freedom during the pandemic, at our homes, in our cities, in our schools, parks, in hotels when we are lucky, if we were lucky to travel, our elderly in their residential care units, and people who were in some ways already confined before the pandemic, such as prisoners or refugees, have even become more restricted during the pandemic. So issues of confinement restrictions can give us new insights beyond the prison walls and perhaps beyond the pandemic. This again would necessitate connecting with different research disciplines, namely sport for development and the incarceration or confinement literature. For example, what can the sport for development field learn from research that has been done in relation to people who are in many ways confined, both in time and place? It is exactly that Mark Norman explores in his paper presentation. And finally, it's a pleasure to also have somebody from the field who will reflect on the impact that the pandemic has had on her own work. So that's it from my part. I'd like to thank the excellent staff from Cogitatio. For me, the Cogitatio Journal of Social Inclusion is one of the best and affordable, important golden access journals I know, with an impact factor. So I thank the speakers for making this webinar possible. Enjoy the presentations, read the papers, don't hesitate to join the debate and reach out to each other to further develop the sport for development and peace field. And if you have an idea of a special issue on sport for development and the pandemic, post-pandemic, also feel free to contact me or each other. So I'll give the floor to Rob.
Thanks, Rain, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the research that my colleagues Anne Bunde-Baroost, Sally Nathan and Patrick Rawstorn and myself have been focused on over the last couple of years. And that's basically been focused on young people and their experience of sport for development programs and the impact on their life trajectories, looking at the long-term impact of these programs. So as many of you today, those that have logged in today would be aware already, youth-focused sport for development programs really started to emerge in the early to mid-2000s. And since then, there's been a rapid growth globally in regards to the amount of programs that are being conducted worldwide. And over the past decade, as Rain's already mentioned, there's been a significant increase in research looking at the impact of these programs. And this research has mostly been focused, the vast majority of the research has been focused on short-term impacts of these programs. And that was surprising to me, given that the children and adolescents who participated in the early programs are now adults. It provides a perfect opportunity to look at how these programs do impact on the longer term development of participants of these programs. So it's this gap in knowledge that really prompted the question that helped guide our research. Do sport-based youth development programs have any long-term impact on the life trajectories of young people from diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds? So I was very motivated to take this study on and my wider PhD project on this topic because of my professional history. So I've come to academia mid-career and worked in the field in the youth sector for over 20 years and have used sport as an engagement tool, a therapeutic tool and a development tool over that time. And I had seen the, at times, transformative impact of these programs on the lives of young people. So I was really motivated to look at the mechanisms, the reasons, the why and the how that these programs may have the potential to impact the lives of young people in these contexts. But I needed a program to be able to look at these longer term impacts. And that's when I came across the Football United program that began in 2006 with the aim of, at that stage, supporting refugee and newly arrived young people in their resettlement into the local communities in Sydney, Australia. The program since then, over the 15 years since the introduction of the program, has evolved to become a multi-strategic capacity building program that has engaged with thousands upon thousands of young people in Sydney, Australia, and maintained a focus on disadvantaged and diverse groups of young people in these regions as well. So the study itself, it was a qualitative inquiry using in-depth interviews with 20 former participants in the Football United program. And we ensured that there was a minimum 6-year gap between participants' initial involvement in the program and their participation in the study. And this was really important. The timeframe was important because the study aims to examine the participants' perceptions of whether fun had any influence on their life trajectory. So that time frame allows for that reflection. It enabled them to reflect on a range of life experiences post their involvement in the program and reflect on whether the program had any impact on their lives over that period of time. So what we found through our study, the findings did demonstrate that participants did perceive that the program had influenced their life trajectories. The relationships participants formed through Football United had the greatest impact. So it clearly came through that the key theme throughout the study was that relationships had the greatest impact. And this was in particular for participants who had experienced displacement and trauma as refugees prior to resettlement in Australia. And that's important to note. These young people, by creating relationships within the program, it created a sense of belonging for them within the program and also a sense of belonging in their local communities. And that was a key part. That's not necessarily new for sport for development and youth-based sport for development programs. It has come out in research before. But what is new is that these young people aligned that sense of belonging to decision-making and their life trajectories and the decisions they made throughout their lives as well, and the impact that the program had at them on the time, but also throughout their lives as well. Findings also suggested that the mentoring relationships between participants and the Football United program staff were instrumental in young participants pursuing their educational and their career goals. The mentoring program within Football United came through clearly as an instrumental impact on the lives of the young people within the programs as well. The study also highlighted the participants' motivation to embrace a long-term commitment to give back to their local cultural, ethnic and geographical communities. And they did this in a number of ways, and it could have been careers, so going into teaching, social work, youth work, legal careers, for example, or it could have been creating their own sport for development program, working in the community sector, and really giving back to their local communities. And they attributed, at least partly, their giving back to their communities from what they've learnt within the program, be that life skills or leadership development. The findings are very important for the youth-focused sport for development sector. It does suggest that these programs have the potential to positively influence the life trajectories of at least some participants. This is crucial. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of research has focused on short-term outcomes in weeks and months. We're looking retrospectively at the impact on the lives of young people over numerous years. So that is a significant outcome and finding of the study. So the study could inform the implementation and design of youth-focused sport for development programs, And it could inform them and encourage them to actively incorporate strategies that enhance relationship building, life skills, leadership development, particularly when providing programs for young people from disadvantaged and diverse backgrounds. The findings of this study could also be used to inform future longer-term impact studies. We're really encouraging the findings of this study to be tested both qualitatively and quantitatively in other research to test the findings of this study as well. Finally, and to the topic of today's session, for me to end on, I did want to reference the findings of this study to what we're going through globally with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a crucial element of what we found and how that relates to what we're going through at the moment. So relationship building was a key finding of what the participants perceived as having the greatest impact on them. What we found through the past 18 months is social connectedness has been impacted for young people globally and has led to a sense of isolation. So the very function that a lot of these programs could potentially have in the lives of young people is put at risk, and that risk is great. So a lot of sport for development programs have pivoted to the online space, including Football United and many other agencies throughout the world. And that presents both opportunities and challenges for us in practice and also in research as well. What we have shown through the past years that life skills programs can be able to be run online and can be effective. The big question for me, and from speaking to colleagues in the space, is social connectedness included in that? So that's more of a question that I'm posing than answering. But if we are to provide some of these programs online, does that enhance social connectedness? Like the findings of our study has found, the importance of these programs, does it still have the same impact in regards to relationship building with peers and mentors as well? And that's what I'd like to look at in the future as well, and also discuss with colleagues, and really interested and looking forward to the question and answer section of today's section to tease that out a little bit more. So how do we minimise risks to relationship building? I think we definitely need to look at more closely working with co-design with young people. So co-designing programs, particularly in the online space, if that work is to continue, using the strengths and the assets of young people to make the technology work best for them, to help maintain that social connectedness with their peers and their mentors as well. So there are opportunities, there are risks, but there's definitely a lot of work for us as researchers, as academics, but more importantly in the field in regards to how we take on this challenge and how it influences both practice and research into the future. And that is it for me. So I'll pass back to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I believe it's me next. So hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. My name's Emily Hayday, and I'm a lecturer at Loughborough University, London, within the Institute for Sport Business. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you, similarly to like Rob just did, some reflections and key findings from a paper that we did for this social inclusion issue. And specifically, this is based on some work that I've been doing with my colleague, Dr. Holly Collison, for the last year or two, and that we're still continuing now, which specifically looked at exploring the possibility or potential for social inclusion and specifically gender inclusivity within esports spaces. So I guess just in line with the webinar and the focus of the reality that we're all still living with at the moment, I think how to frame this best would be for us to think of, in a post-pandemic world, what might sport for development work look like? If we all reflect on changing behaviours, disruptions to our normal social practices, and I'm sure if none of us hear the phrase lockdown again, that won't be too soon, global economic uncertainty, and as was mentioned right at the start, this sort of heightened digital connectivity and digital transformation of a lot of practices, whether that be the way we are conducting our work, how we're interacting with our friends and family, as well as how we have seen people looking to fill that void from an entertainment perspective, which has led to the rise in gaming and esport. How might the sport for development sector need to innovate to survive and flourish in this ever-changing environment? We can see, and I'm sure many of you are aware, that esport is now a fundamental element of digital youth culture today. And we wanted to consider if and how esport could be used within sport for development programming as a new hook to both either complement or be used as a new methodology within sport for development work. So what did we specifically do? We conducted some exploratory research throughout 2019, which we wanted to first understand what that esport landscape looked like, and specifically those digital spaces where gaming, interaction and activity is actually happening, and then specifically understand its utility as a space to enact social inclusion. And really, as a sort of sub area of that, we wanted to understand if it was a site that facilitated sort of positive, inclusive experiences for women and girls. And we were fascinated by the foundation and the way in which esport could act as a mechanism that is naturally inclusive. So within traditional sport, we often see the sort of separation of genders. So you'd have a male's team and a women's team, or a male and female team. And that is often linked to sort of deep-rooted cultures, but also the elements of physicality that are required for those sports. Unlike many traditional sports, it is possible for male and female participants to participate and compete equally together in the same competition. And so we wanted to look at what that might look like and what may support or hamper the possibility for esport to be used as an inclusive space. And as I'll talk about shortly, we see some very some norms, practices and cultures like we see in traditional sport, which currently is sort of limiting the opportunities that esport has in terms of entering those sort of development spaces. So we conducted interactive focus groups. We wanted to hear from key actors from both the esport and the sport for development industries. So we invited key game publishers from across the globe. We had representation from a lot of the international game publishers. We had local, national and international sport for development and NGO organisations represented. We had some professional and community esport teams, tournament organisers of different esport tournaments and some gamers. And we had 65 stakeholders involved in that process. And the aim was to understand what these spaces currently look like and if there was a capacity and appetite to consider and see how esport could be used as a social inclusion space, and specifically what were the experiences of women and girls within those spaces. So we did a series of activities. We really wanted to get some interesting sort of rich debates going. So we created some predetermined statements which focused on our theoretical framework, which looked at key indicators of social inclusion, but also the notion of space and how that is created and enacted, and also looked at gendered behaviours, stereotypes, and how social inclusion could be brought to light within those esport online spaces. Everyone also completed a persona template where they reflected on their experiences as either an actor or a participant within esport or the sport for development sector, and looked at the challenges and experiences they faced. We also had some expert speakers show some case studies on how esport is already being used for social good, and some of those examples did link into this social inclusion agenda, which sort of sparked interesting discussions between sport for development stakeholders and esport stakeholders around some of the tensions that exist between these two industries. We then conducted supplementary interviews to sort of, based on the themes we discovered from the focus groups, to ensure that we could gather richer accounts of what was currently going on. And what did we find? From a philosophical perspective, so thinking about how the space is perceived and what the space represents, so how people within the esport industry, whether that be key stakeholders or gamers themselves, there was this belief that that digital spaces for gamers are about providing that sense of belonging, building people and helping people create their identity, providing that sense of community. And it was mentioned time and time again that it was seen as this space that was open for all, and it was about how people created their own, it formed a core part of who they are. This was really important because it sort of showed to us that fundamentally there is an opportunity for inclusion and a space for all, and engagement and interaction through digital esports spaces. Yet, and there was a but coming, currently what we're seeing is the way the spaces are being produced, due to the sort of competitive and fractured nature of the industry, has led to these sort of tribal mentalities, unequal participation and exclusionary boundaries being creating these sort of structures and boundaries that are affecting the way and who can access the space specifically. And then through that, we're seeing the types of behaviours and interactions that are occurring in these spaces, not by all, but by a proportion of people, was sort of negative gender discourses and a lot of toxic behaviour. And this sort of hyper-masculine behaviour that was being showcased by some gamers was about protecting this sort of collective identity that had been built up from when the spaces were originally created. But what is really important to note is that there was a heavy resistance and an acknowledgement and a responsibility by both gamers and key stakeholders that now the esport industry has moved out of that sort of development phase and it's established as sort of a cornerstone of the entertainment and sports industry, being a multi-billion-dollar industry, that there is a sign that there is a need to challenge and tackle some of these behaviours. And many key actors now are advocating for diversity, inclusion, and trying to remove these toxic behaviours from the industry. And so we heard about lots of great examples of how this is being tackled, like we see in traditional sport, mechanisms being put in place to try and reduce this negative behaviour. And it comes back to this idea of regulation and governance, which is still currently being, is a bit of a contentious point within the esport industry of how these systems get regulated because of the way the system is structured through quite a siloed game publisher system. But we saw some brilliant examples of how game design is being considered to ensure that female avatars are not being sexualized, the rise of specific organizations that are trying to tackle and encourage more diversity and inclusion within gaming, such as Women in Games and Negi. Also in the news, if you follow it more recently, we've seen game publishers like Vrije put moderation tools in some of their games like Valorant, which is now going to moderate voice chat to remove toxic behavior. And I think reflecting on our research, what was really important was that there was an appetite from sport for development stakeholders to look at how they could use online and digital methodologies to enhance their programming, yet there was a need for some of the internal perceptions and challenges that the industry is currently grappling with, especially around this toxicity, to be better managed before they would consider or be able to see the opportunity for a partnership. So critically, what our research found was that the ideological foundations of esport do and would support a sport for development inclusion agenda. Yet the current toxic practices are disrupting the possibilities for future sport for development partnerships. I think, like a few of the speakers have already spoken about, we're all experiencing some form of hybrid life now, where digital and physical is coming together. And I think this is where we see the real potential of being able to look at how sport for development spaces could capitalise on the popularity and opportunities that esports provides to their programming. In terms of future research, we identified the limitations that we only conducted this in a couple of global contexts with relatively small stakeholder numbers. And so we would want to see if similar views and perceptions were evident in other global contexts. Also now with COVID, times have moved on since we did this research, and perceptions and attitudes have changed, as well as there is better regulation within the esport industry already now from when we conducted the research. And I think attitudes more broadly towards esport have changed. Like the World Health Organization, for example, did a big U-turn from having esport listed as an addictive practice and had it under the same banner as taking certain drugs, to then having a stay at home and game together campaign where they worked with lots of different stakeholders from the esport industry to say, look at how we could leverage this as a tool to connect during a time of social isolation. So just to finish off, I think what's really important is esport it has the foundations to be a very inclusive base that could then be leveraged by different development stakeholders. And as regulation and governance improves within the esport industry, I think we're going to see a lot of more opportunities for external stakeholders to leverage and access esport as a mechanism to engage with youth populations to achieve broader social outcomes increase. And I think we're going to end up seeing a lot of hybrid models, which is what we want to test in our next phase of research, and work with some specific sport for development organisations to look at how, for example, say within a football foundation, you could have some physical programming and then some digital programming as a hybrid model within a sport for development program to look at the opportunities and outcomes that would create. And I think linked to what Rob said through his research, I think that having that digital access and engagement provides the opportunity for longer term strategy development within sport for development, rather than having a very siloed point in time that you engage with a participant and then you never see them again. So it might provide the opportunity for longer term connection and engagement to have a more longitudinal program. Looking forward to any questions that anyone might have, and I'll pass over to the next speaker.
Hi everyone, I'm just gonna share an image quickly. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Great. All right, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. The picture on the screen shows two images juxtaposed. In the first, we see adult prisoners playing rugby in an Argentinian prison. And in the second, we see children playing football in a United Nations refugee camp in Niger. One of these settings, the refugee camp, has been a focus for sport for development support and funding and research, while the other, the prison, largely has not. Clearly, these are very different spaces where sport is taking place, yet, as I will discuss in this talk, and as I wrote in my paper, I argue that there are also important commonalities between these spaces, and that we need to think more deeply about the similarities between spaces of confinement, such as prisons and refugee camps, as well as other places where people are involuntarily held in congregate settings, and the potential social impact of sport in such spaces. Further, I will argue that other spaces where sport for development programs occur, there are important characteristics of confinement that should be considered by practitioners, by researchers, and by policymakers. To develop this argument, and as I did in the paper, I draw from the work of human geographers working in the subfield of carceral geography, who have identified spatial or space-related characteristics of, quote unquote, the carceral. That is the experience of detriment and harm that emerges from the intentional creation of spaces designed for punishment, confinement, surveillance, and/or regulation. I'll stop the image now. My research has included a focus on the social meanings of sport in prisons, largely in Canada. Over several projects, I've conducted research with former adult prisoners, former and current prison staff in both adult and youth institutions, and volunteer sport and physical activity instructors, mostly yoga instructors, who have worked with both adult and youth prison populations. Using perspectives from sociology, criminology, and human geography, I've analyzed how sport can be used to improve prisoners' conditions of confinement, provide them with pleasurable and healthy experiences, and potentially provide tools and resources that can help them navigate life and avoid reoffending upon their release. On the other hand, I've also analyzed the ways in which sport can be much more problematic. It can be used as part of an administrative effort to control the behavior of prison populations. And sport can also be used to increase the detrimental aspects of confinement, or given the potential downsides of sport, such as hypercompetition or aggressive masculinity, even contribute to negative social experiences for many prisoners. In my paper in this special issue of Social Inclusion, I presented theoretical reasons for scholars to consider how findings from research on sport in prisons and other sites of incarceration can inform a deeper understanding of some sport for development interventions. And I do want to be clear, this won't apply to every sport for development site. And I argue that research on sport for development and research on sport in incarceration should be brought in closer alignment. While my paper was largely focused theoretically, I believe there are important implications for bringing these areas together beyond research, including for policy development and including for the lived experiences of people experiencing harm and detriment in carceral spaces. To return briefly to the image I began with, spaces of confinement such as prisons and refugee camps have been labeled by human geographers as compact carceral spaces. That is, physical sites that are contained, that are prisons or bear similarities or hallmarks of prisons, such as the planned confinement of people in an environment that causes them to experience detriment or harm compared to what they would experience outside of those spaces. And that's true regardless of whether the intention of confinement is intended to be punitive or rehabilitative, as in the case of prisons, or whether it's meant to be humanitarian in the case of refugee camps. So the intention of the confinement, although it will affect obviously the experiences of people, does not necessarily change whether or not it's considered from this perspective to be a carceral space. The field of carceral geography, however, has also identified the fact that prison-like characteristics are seen in a wide variety of non-compact spaces, which they label diffuse carceral spaces. So we have compact and diffuse carceral spaces. In diffuse spaces, elements of our incarceration are produced through social and technological means. So we can think of the way that at-risk youth might be surveyed and monitored through their participation in various social programs. How technologies such as electronic monitoring or tracking can extend a prison sentence beyond the prison walls, or the social stigma that's experienced in various community spaces by former prisoners who may remain negatively and detrimentally impacted by their period of incarceration for years or even decades after they've served their sentence. And there are compelling reasons to consider and develop connections between carceral sport and sport for development research in both compact and diffuse carceral spaces. In terms of compact carcerality, there are over 10.7 million people in prison or detention around the globe, as well as an additional 2.6 million refugees living in camps and an unknown number of migrants forcibly confined in over 2,000 detention camps in 100 countries. While there is considerable variation of conditions within and between these types of confinement, these spaces share many characteristics, not only carceral characteristics, but also the prominent social role of sport in the daily lives of many people living there. Meanwhile, with regard to diffuse carcerality and its potential links to sport, I believe it's important to understand the carceral characteristics and the ways they create detriment and harm of particular sport spaces. And this is particularly key for sport for development programs that may inadvertently create experiences of diffuse carcerality for participants. For example, programs that label participants as at risk, midnight sport programs that target specific urban populations to reduce crime, or inner city or slum-based sport for development programs that may stigmatize residents of these spaces by labeling the spaces in those ways, or be drawing upon populations who have experienced diffuse carcerality in their daily lives. So emerging from my research, I have several recommendations to make sport in carceral spaces and sport for development interventions more meaningful for participants and hopefully more liberatory. First, sport for development programs should take account of how they may create or exacerbate existing spatial experiences of carcerality. For example, labeling participants at risk or partnering with police or other authorities without considering participants' relationship to these groups. This is particularly important in diffuse spaces where the carceral elements may not be readily visible to sport for development practitioners. Whether in a site of confinement or a diffuse space, sport should be used to counteract the carceral experiences of participants, even if this is temporary. For example, focusing on prison sport, there's evidence from research that sport can provide some prisoners with a mental escape from the daily realities of prison life, or help address the trauma they have experienced in their past and imagine new future selves, or rehumanize them in an otherwise dehumanizing environment. These are important and potentially transformative possible outcomes. Finally, as others have recognized, for sport to play such a role, it should de-emphasize violent or exclusionary characteristics that can harm participants, such as hypercompetition, sexism and homophobia, and aggression and violence. Too often, sport is offered by well-meaning practitioners without a consideration of its many potential downsides. It is possible for sport to be empowering or even liberatory for participants, but this is not inevitable. And it's certainly unlikely to occur in carceral spaces, whether compact or diffuse, if practitioners do not take account of the experiences of detriment and harm created by carceral space and experienced by participants. Future research should more deeply explore the links between sport and carceral space and sport for development, and seek to develop clear best practices to guide the work of sport practitioners in these spaces. This is particularly true in the time of COVID-19. Focusing on prisons, for example, prisoners worldwide have been ravaged by disease in the unhealthy physical space of prisons. Many prisoners have been locked down and had their access to programs, including outdoor recreation, restricted, and the fear and risks brought on by the pandemic have created severe strains on the physical, mental, and social health of prisoners. For sport to play a role in pandemic recovery in carceral spaces, it must therefore be particularly thoughtfully and sensitively delivered. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Mark. Saraswati, before we jump on to you, just a small note that the attendees can make their questions or any comments they have in the Q&A format in the bottom of the screen, as the chat for attendees is now disabled. Saraswati, please.
Hello, my name is Saraswati, and today I am going to share my personal experience of how sports have promoted inclusion, how COVID-19 have affected our work and future prospect in the area of post-pandemic time. I am an accredited coach in coaches across continent and working at NAS Foundation. I have more than 9 years of experience using sports for development at the grassroots level, leading many initiatives within NAS Foundation, such as organizing training for the trainers and bringing to life our child protection policy, and running CSE on-field program across India and internationally in the Philippines. CSE is impacted 132 countries with 477 organizations. We work with partner organizations to tackle all 17 of the United National Sustainable Development Goals. The core behind CSE is this idea of purposeful play, that young people can learn about complicated social issues outside of the classroom through play on the playground. During the 2020 pandemic, CSE put extra focus on UNSDG 3.4, which is focus on mental health. They did this through creating and distributing unique free curriculum for their global network. If anyone is interested to look the curriculum, how it look like, you can send me an email and contact me. As an accredited coach and key leader in NAS, we have prioritized UNSDG goal 5.1, which is discrimination against women and girls. In India, for adolescent girls face discrimination on each level, which is a barrier to realize their rights and reach their potential. NAS works with girls from economically disadvantaged background and uses sports to bring self-confidence under their rights, obtain their agency, and develop leadership. Gender inequality leading to a lack of mobility, access to public space, early age marriages, and challenging in opting for higher education, lack of role models, using their voices, negotiating with even family for the choices. In my opinion, girls have fewer opportunities to play, and whereas boys are encouraged to go out, girls are socialized to ensure that they are safe and they don't attract attention, they don't voice their opinion and don't express themselves, don't be present in the public spaces and don't make noise and not appreciate physical skills. When girls come first time on the ground in our program, in NAS Foundation, participate in the sports activities, they do not seem very comfortable while jumping, running, even not yelling loud for the ball while playing. And gradually you can observe the change in their body language, how they occupy the space and negotiating to be part of the netball team. This is the change sports bring in the lives of adolescents who are restricted by societal norms. And these small changes are the first step, can lead to bigger changes like delaying early age marriages, negotiating with the family for higher education, and for even pursuing their career, their dreams. Sports is our tool. NAS use netball as a tool to deliver life skill sessions. It has been hard during the lockdown to conduct sports activities, and we did stick with our mission, empowering individual and creating ecosystem in the areas of gender, health, and rights. I would like to say also, in general in India, there is stress on children academic performance and sports have less priorities. And then COVID happens and adolescents are not playing sports. For example, in Europe and in USA, the first priority has been to children going to school and go back to normal. As in India, where most children lives in extended family. Most children in India have not gone to school since March 2020, and that most can also not be reached through digital media, so that we moved our program and our work to small groups in the communities. And we also been reaching out to adolescents online who have access to digital media. I still want to emphasize that digital platform is still challenging to reach out to adolescents girls, as not all have smartphone and good network. Hybrid models, which includes physical fitness and life skill sessions, help adolescents girls to create learning environment, creating flexibility in the program. And life skill module have helped us also conducting short-term programs and to reach out to communities. For example, the session on leadership and how this leadership can actually play by the girls in the home, like how they can be a leader for the home, where they can encourage to wear a mask to their parents, and creating those do's and don'ts for the families to be safe in this situation, you know. And due to COVID, there were many on-field activities paused, but their importance remained the same. In NAS, adolescents have led an advocacy project with school principals to advocate for inclusion of physical education and life skill education in online classes. And for it to be continued when the school resumed, we call this Tarangini. I want to wrap up my short talk with a thought in terms of future prospect for the area in post-pandemic time. I think it is important to acknowledging that, you know, collaboration between NGOs is good, particularly in a post-pandemic world. But it is also equally important to recognize that all these relationships will need to reevaluate some of their structure and priorities in order to adapt to the effect of the pandemic. The way we understand education, the toll on adolescents' mental health from the lockdowns, the access of safe spaces for the girls. I think sports and play can have a bigger role to fill these gaps. This shift might not be going to be easy, but that's okay. I mean, we need to accept it. And in my opinion, shared learning is very important, as new problems comes with new solutions. Unlike in the past, set curriculum worked well. However, in present and future need more flexibility, better preparation, and building staff capacity for those challenges. We need to accept that this will be our reality in future for some time. Uncertainty is high, and it is important us to do this, as I mentioned, that girls are more vulnerable. Thank you for listening me.
Saraswati, thank you very much. Thank you also, everyone, for your presentations. Questions are coming in. I will read the first two. Okay, so the first one is directed to Emily. Okay, from Tarafoy. It reads, is the potential for eSport to be used for inclusivity not a challenge, given the costs involved with participation? How do we overcome this barrier? In the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere, the pandemic really highlighted the digital divide, something that is surely not exclusive to internet laptop access, but also impact access to gaming consoles. Mm-hmm. There is also, before we jump to answering, there's also a second question, okay, from Cocky Van Dam. It was asked during Rob's presentation, but I think it would be important to hear all the contributors' opinion on this. And Cocky Van Dam asks, any difference between the findings among men and women? Okay, so perhaps, Emily, we would go first with your question, and then the difference between men and women, we can follow the same order. So then Rob, Emily, and Mark. Rein, if you want to step in any time, do feel free. Emily.
Thank you for your question. Really important point, and I think considering access constraints is, sorry, that's the dog barking in the background, I apologise. Given access constraints and people's level of ability to engage with certain technologies is something that has definitely, you're right, been brought to light during the pandemic. We have seen, for example, I'll just give an example from the UK, different organisations, like you would do with other traditional sports, providing access to certain consoles or equipment as part of the programming, so that would be factored in. However, what I think is really important in terms of meaning that divide will not have, that digital divide won't be so prolific in terms of if this was considered and utilised more holistically within sport for development programming, is the rise of mobile devices being used in esports and gaming. And we've seen a lot of publishers look at how their games can be adapted or played through mobile technology, as opposed to needing, you know, very sophisticated, expensive consoles or playing through a PC or laptop. And I think that's going to reduce significantly this discrepancy between access, especially from an equipment standpoint, for people being able to engage in digital and esport programming. I think done correctly, through more accessible devices, it could be used very successfully, although it will need a lot of considerations of how that would fit into the broader sort of methodologies used, you know, taking into account some of the challenges I mentioned earlier that still need to sort of be ironed out. But I think there's a lot of potential here, and I think the appetite, especially for going digital and having some sort of hybrid model, is going to be where I think we're going to see the first transition into this space. And, you know, even speaking from personal experience, from speaking to some industry stakeholders, there's already been a lot of interest in looking at how could we actually do this. And by utilising mobile devices, that seems to be the most attractive proposition that provides access to the widest range of participants. Hopefully, Tara, that answered your question. Rodrigo, did you say there was the other question, wasn't there? But that wasn't for me, was it? Is there a difference between males and females?
We can start perhaps with Rob, if it's okay. So any difference in your findings between
mine,
men
okay,
and women?
It was actually really interesting that I think it was about 65% of our stakeholders and interviewees were male. So it wasn't as if we had, might even have been 70%. Sorry, I don't know the figure exactly. So the majority of our participants were actually male, although we still did have good representation from female industry stakeholders and from gamers themselves. And male participants were aware of these issues as well, acknowledged them, often highlighted the challenges that they saw in overcoming these sort of masculine cultures and practices and behaviours that have become commonplace. You know, toxic gamer culture is quite well known now as a concept. For any of you that follow this space, Gamergate was a really big sort of example of this, where there was specific discrimination towards female gamers and streamers specifically. And so females obviously were able to articulate their personal experiences of what they'd experienced and how they maybe didn't feel welcome in some of these spaces. But I think male participants were equally aware of it, and there was a strong sense of an important cultural shift that was needed to try and eradicate some of the more negative behaviours that were very discriminatory, sexist, or hypermasculine, to ensure that the space could be more inclusive.
Rob, can we hear your takes on this?
Sure, and look, we had in our sample of interviewees, we had slightly more females than males, and my thoughts prior to the research was there would be differences, but interestingly enough, there wasn't. When we conducted our thematic analysis of the key findings, they were remarkably similar between the male and female participants, which I found really interesting. I think that still needs to be tested out. It's a relatively small sample. We've had thousands of young people go through the Football United program, and we interviewed 20. So we do need to test that out in a larger study, and I'd like to look at that quantitatively. However, yeah, interestingly enough, there wasn't a key difference in the data that we collected from the interviewees.
Mark, can we hear your takes on this too, in your research?
Sure. I'll maybe stick to kind of sport and prisons, which is what I know best. It's a great question, and prisons are a strange kind of societal institution in that I don't remember the exact figures, but I think something like 94 or 95% of prisoners worldwide are male. And that reflects all kinds of different broader issues around gender in societies. But I mean, a lot of what I touched on around sort of the need to consider how sport can kind of be used problematically, or can have problematic outcomes, was related more to men's prisons around kind of violence and aggression, or like kind of hyper masculinity. That said, I did find in speaking with some female former prisoners that there were still ways in which sport could be socially exclusive, could kind of contribute to and reflect social hierarchies that marginalized certain women, and that impacted, for example, their ability to access recreation spaces. Like say there was a limited amount of equipment to use or something like that. So there were ways in which maybe less aggressive or physically violent, but still in which, you know, hierarchies and social exclusion impacted the experiences of women prisoners. And I think oftentimes just reflecting kind of the broader construction of sport socially, it might be assumed that men will be more interested in sport, and also that there's maybe more of a fear amongst staff that we need to kind of occupy them, that kind of social control aspect I touched on briefly, where sports is used to kind of occupy time and hope that they'll kind of direct their aggression that way, whereas with women, it's maybe that assumption isn't there, so it's sort of more of an afterthought compared with other types of programming. So in terms, I mean, there's lots more to unpack there, but in terms of sort of the implications, I would say that, I mean, ultimately, I guess what I was kind of, if I had a bit more time, I was going to get at is if to kind of overcome these negative aspects of carceral space, I think that sport for development practitioners need to engage with the people who are actually experiencing the detriment and the harm caused by that, and find out if and how sport might play a role in, you know, providing some kind of benefit or you know, slightly ameliorating some of those harmful impacts. And I think that's especially the case when it comes to gender, and thinking through, you know, being sensitive to the way in which the way those spaces are gendered will affect the experiences. So that's, and I should add quickly, there are also a lot of issues for transgender prisoners, because prisons almost exclusively operate on a gender binary of male female, and there's that leaves people who don't identify as male or female in a really difficult space that they have to navigate, often causing them to experience a great deal of threats or harm or just negative experiences. And I think, you know, there's a long way to go in terms of sport in prison, in terms of making it more positive or beneficial, but I think that's something that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Saraswati, your presentation touched on a lot, especially on this point of the gender divide. Do you want to provide some quick remarks on this question? I think we may have temporarily lost Saraswati. Perhaps we can go the next question until we have her back. Another round of questions. Emily, you have another one for you from Mohammed Altani. He asks, in the world of esports, it can be difficult for girls and women, given that they are often undermined by male competitors. How do you foster their value in such environments? And then another question before, again, we jump. This one is so not targeted to anyone, so I believe we can also ask you all this opinion. Gabriela Timofsky-Jonet asks, how might COVID-19 affect sports on a longer term basis, or on a longer term? What can we expect? Emily, regarding your question.
Okay, so in response to, I'm not on mute, good, I thought I was on mute then. In response to Mohammed's question, thank you for that. I think it's a really important question, because like I've shown from the results from our research, but also given the sort of deep-rooted masculine cultures that currently exist and are present within esports spaces, there is an important step that needs to be taken in sort of trying to change or alter those cultures. So I think game design is one of the most powerful ways in which this can be done, and we are seeing now a lot of game publishers identifying the need to change the way in which they're presenting both the narrative and the role that female characters are playing within the game, and also the way they are visually presented. So a study that was conducted by Van den Butch and colleagues in 2016 actually showed that from doing an analysis of popular esport games, female characters were 8 times more likely to be sexualized, and the nature of their role within the game was often to be sort of like needing to be rescued. So they were playing a much more submissive character, almost like that damsel in distress sort of portrayal. And so I think there's been an acknowledgement that if those sort of stereotypes and gender biases and cultures are being almost supported through the game dynamic, we're not shifting or promoting females within those spaces. It's almost continuing this sort of narrative around that we've often seen lead to sort of female inequality in broader spaces. Also, there's the role of a lot of agencies and organisations which are advocating and promoting females within these spaces. So Any Key that I mentioned earlier is an inclusive organisation that is promoting and helping policy change to try and bring acknowledgement to females in gaming spaces. And we are seeing a lot of females at the grassroots level participating in gaming. It's more when you get to that more elite level, we're not seeing that transition. So it's about promoting role models and helping people see that being a woman in tech or gaming is a feasible career path and that it is a future for them. So I think it's around awareness, changing some of the ways in which females are portrayed, and also, like I mentioned in my presentation, tackling some of that toxic behaviour, which is meaning the space doesn't feel like a safe space for females. So they need to feel welcomed and able to access those spaces and have male allies that are challenging those behaviours. And over time, it's not going to be a quick fix, those spaces should become more accessible and appropriate for broader audiences. Hopefully that answered your question, Mohammed. It's a very tricky topic, and there's differences between games as well, and some are doing this better than others already in terms of their portrayals of females and how they are, you know, advocating for more female participation and championing that. The other question, I've already forgotten it, something about COVID long-term.
The impact of long-term, yes, of COVID in sports for development.
I didn't hear you, Rodrigo, then.
Oh,
I don't know why.
No, yes. Better now?
There you go.
Yes, yeah. So Gabrielle asked, how might COVID-19 affect sport for development more on a long-term basis? So
okay.
Now.
Interesting question. I think, sorry to repeat what I said earlier, but I think we're going to see a need to adapt to the new normal, as we're seeing, you know, disruptions to a lot of practices and almost like the norms that we see in society, and also economic uncertainty. I think what I mentioned in my presentation around hybrid models is going to become more and more prolific. And I think although that offers lots of opportunities, there's still challenges that need to be considered with that, and it's whole new methodology that needs to be, you know, interwoven into the practices of sport for development. And I also think we're going to see a lot of new stakeholders coming into the space to try and innovate. So like Ren mentioned right at the start, around almost like we've reached a point of saturation, both in terms of what sport for development programming looks like, but also who is funding it. I think by changing the methodologies and what we're actually trying to do and innovating to use new methodologies to try and tackle some of these broader social issues, I think we're going to see new stakeholders and collaborations, which offers opportunities for innovation, but also ability to bring new money and ideas to the space.
Thank you, Emily. Rob, can we hear your takes on this, on the longer term impact of COVID-19 research?
Yeah, look, my take is that it goes beyond COVID-19. So I've done a lot of work in post-disaster settings. So I think COVID-19 does come into a broader umbrella of environmental disasters, man-made disasters in regards to its impacts on, development overall, but also sport for development as well. So I think it's a broader challenge than just COVID-19. It's how we maintain existing programs, but how we innovate to maintain the supports for participants that may impact programs through these disasters. So, for example, when I look at my work and specifically young people, it's important that we keep programs going to provide that connectedness, to provide that support to young people, have that outlet for sport. So the challenge is how we do that. Online does work for certain, in certain contexts, but not everyone. So I think it's a larger discussion about how we innovate more broadly for sport for development overall. I don't have all the answers. I'm probably posing more questions than answers at the moment, but I think it's definitely a space we need to do some more thinking and collaboration on within the sector.
Thank you, Rob. Mark, can we hear your thoughts on this, on the longer term impact?
Sure. Yeah, I think my big takeaway point would be that the impacts of COVID-19 in the long term are going, well, they are being, but will continue to be, unless action is taken, be felt by those who are most vulnerable already in society. And that, for sport for development programming that is trying to engage with those populations, whether in prisons or elsewhere, that really needs to be recognized. Like Rob said, it's it's not unlike other kind of events that could create kind of post-traumatic stress for some people. There will be like economic and livelihood impacts. The sort of whatever recovery looks like societally will probably be least felt by those who are most marginalized. So I think that sport for development really needs to be sensitive to that and careful about making sure that it's actually providing something that will help the people it's trying to help, rather than just kind of going in with assumptions that it will be that and that's a broader critique in sport for development, but I think that's almost exacerbated by COVID-19 and the kind of the way it's going to impact vulnerable people. So that would be my kind of broad takeaway, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Saraswati, we did not have the opportunity to hear your answer on the Cocky Van Dam's question, the difference in this case in your work, the differences between men and women. Can we hear your quick remarks on this part?
Yes. Because of COVID, I think, the more impact actually is on women and on girls, because I mean, in general, if there is no pandemic, still, if you can see like how girls are actually not able to access safe spaces for the play, not even able to go out and meet the friends. So, and in the society, in India especially, encouraging girls for play, it's not something like very popular. And if there are girls who play sports, it's very professional. Like, we encourage like girls if they are going for something professional. But sports, we do not see like in terms of playful and for the joy and meeting your friends and sharing your thoughts. And yeah, so I think girls are affecting more in terms of also even being at home. It's difficult for them to cope up with the violence, like different kind of violence. And and if there is no one to share and listen to them, like if they want to reach out to someone, like there are very less stakeholders or people or government officials whom they can reach out and talk about them. So I think Though I know I have said in my slide also that, of course, online is being difficult because not everyone has smartphone, but I still believe that, a hybrid model, which can be implemented in the online and on field for the girls will be benefiting to them. Yeah, so we should focus on all the aspects. Yeah.
Saraswati, thank you very much. We are past our time, although the debate is going very, very well. Hyde, some final takes before we close our webinar?
No, just I don't want to put everybody more in their time. Just to thank everybody for their contribution, and I think the 3 papers presentations and also perspectives from Saraswati showed that there are some challenges ahead that were already there before the pandemic, that have become visible during the pandemic, and that are still there to stay after the pandemic. So I'm just very glad that we could have this discussion on 3 very original topics and insights. So that's all for me.
Thank you. So to close, I would like to thank you all again for your presence. It was a very fruitful debate and interesting conversation. The purpose of our event is exactly that, to discuss the most important findings and conclusions of your research, and also how it impacts the life of real people, how it benefits our society, because your research matters to us all. To our attendees, I remind you all that the video of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. You will all be notified. And the thematic issue that served as base for this webinar is available on our website. As always, fully open access. Thank you all, Ryan, Rob, Emily, Mark, Saraswati. A special thanks to coaches across continents and Brian Suskiewicz for their amazing collaboration to make this happen. To our audience, thanks for your interest, your participation, your questions in the webinar, and see you all in Social Inclusion's next webinar. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.